Hello and welcome to our first computer side chat for global issues, where today we are going to be talking about geography and what it is, as well as something that we're going to be calling the 5 themes of geography. Now, as we start to get into the meat of what this class is about and start looking at different regions and the issues within those regions, it's really important that we have some basic geography skills to help us better understand those issues, what causes them, as well as why are they relevant to us. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So the first question I want to ask is, what is geography and what do you think it is? So that we can kind of come up with a common definition. Now, if I were to ask you what it is, especially as high school students, your response to that would probably be something along the line of, geography is about memorizing things on maps. So memorizing the 50 states, memorizing state capitals or the capitals of various countries. That's probably what you would say geography is, because that's probably what your experience with geography is up to this point. And while being able to locate things on a map and understand where things are is an important part of geography, that really isn't what it is all about. So let's go ahead and define what geography is. And for us, geography is the study of the land, features, and inhabitants of Earth and how they interact. So in other words, we're looking at places, the types of things within those places, whether those be natural characteristics or human-made characteristics, and then how people interact with those things. A lot of that will lead, that interaction will be a core part of the issues that we're going to discuss in this class. So that is our basic definition for geography. Now, let's break that down. And we're going to break that down by looking at something we call the 5 themes. And the 5 themes of geography are essentially tools. They're things that we use to kind of diagnose either a given place or the relationship between 2 or more places to better understand some things that are happening in the world. Now, that'll make a little bit more sense after you have learned what these 5 themes are and after we start to apply them in class tomorrow. So let's go ahead and get into those 5 themes. So let's start with the first theme. And the first theme is location. And when we talk about location, there are 2 different types of location, absolute and relative. First, let's define location overall. So location is a way of describing where something is. So pretty simple. If you were to ask where something in Marysville is, you would probably give some kind of characteristic to define its location, whether that's the street it's located on or what it's nearby or how far away it is. So let's define these 2 different types of location. Let's start with absolute. Absolute location is exactly where something is. In other words, an example of that would be if we said something like, the city of Tokyo is located in Japan. Nothing is going to change that. Tokyo is not going to pick up and move somewhere else. That is its absolute location. That is where it is and where it will always be. So that's what we mean by absolute location. Marysville, Ohio is Marysville, Ohio. It doesn't move around. Marysville is not suddenly going to pop up in California or somewhere on the other side of the world. It is where it is. And so that's what we mean by absolute location. Now, relative location is something that changes. The specific definition of relative location is the location of something as related to the location of something else. So, for example, if we looked at this map down at the bottom, you can see the distance measured on a map from Los Angeles to Tokyo. And so an example of that would be Tokyo is 5,451 miles west of Los Angeles. That is Tokyo's location relative to the city of Los Angeles. If we were to say, what is Tokyo's location relative to the city of Beijing in China? Well, that would be Tokyo would be to the east of Beijing, and it certainly would not be as many miles away. Another example of this would be to say something like Marysville is 20 minutes away from Dublin. So you're identifying the location of something relative to something else. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our next theme. Our next theme is place. And we define place as the ways of describing and identifying the characteristics of an area. And there are two different types of things that we use, two different types of characteristics that we use to identify place or to describe place. The first is physical characteristics. And these are features within an area that occur naturally. So this might be a forest or mountains or an ocean or a beach. These are things that exist naturally. They're not man-made. They just exist by way of, they were formed that way by nature. The second thing is human characteristics. And I'm sure you can kind of guess what that is. These are features within an area that are man-made. So buildings, highways, roads, sidewalks, all of these things did not occur naturally. They're created by man. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the third theme. Our third theme is region. And we talk about region, the definition for that is ways of subdividing the world into smaller areas. So, in other words, ways of taking the earth and breaking it down into smaller pieces. So, for example, continents might be an example of that. Countries might be an example of that. States might be an example of that. So let's talk about the different types of regions because there are three that are going to be relevant to us. So the first is formal regions. And these are specific regions or areas designated by an entity such as a government. So in other words, these are regions that we have named something specific. They have an official name. So an example of that might be the Short North in downtown Columbus. That is the official name of that area. Columbus, the government of the city of Columbus, has designated that area of downtown to be Short North. The next type of region is a functional region. And so an example of this would be a central place with surrounding areas that affect or are affected by it. So what we mean is there is some kind of central location that tends to be important, and all of the surrounding things around it are largely dictated or placed within relation to that main or central thing. So if you see down here in the bottom corner, we have the Columbus metropolitan area. And this is a good example of a functional region. In the center here, you see Columbus. And going out from that, you see 270, which goes around it. You see all these other major highways like 71 or 315 or 670. All of them run out from various directions, but they all eventually end up in Columbus. You see all these suburban areas like Westerville or Dublin or Worthington all surround Columbus. So in other words, Columbus is this central place. And because Columbus is a large city with lots of business and other important features, the area around it is geared towards either getting to Columbus or being close enough to it that is advantageous for people to live in those areas to gain access to the city. So when we talk about the greater Columbus area or the greater Central Ohio region, that's a functional area or a functional region that revolves around Columbus. All right, and lastly is perceptual regions. And these are defined by people's feelings and attitudes about an area. So in other words, there isn't a defined border. There isn't a formal region. So for example, another example of a formal region would be the state of Ohio. There's a very clear border and a very clear area for what denotes Ohio. Now for a perceptual region, that might be something like the Middle East. The Middle East is a region of the world that we identify as being in Southwest Asia. That said, there's often debate over what countries do we include in the Middle East? Where do we cut off the Middle East? So an example of that is Egypt part of the Middle East? Some people would argue that yes, it is. Others would argue that no. The Middle East ends before we get to Egypt, and so when we talk about the Middle East, we should not include that as part of the region. So in other words, we perceive what the Middle East is. There is no official definition of what countries within that region are included within the title of the Middle East. All right, well, let's move on once more. So we got two more themes to cover. Next, we have movement. And movement is the spread of people, goods, and ideas around the world. So when we talk about movement, we're not just referring to the movement of people. We're talking about basically the movement of anything, whether that be an individual, whether that be an inanimate object, or whether that be something that isn't even physical, whether it's an idea or a belief or a value system. So we put movement into one of three categories. The first is migration, and this is the movement of people. So, for example, immigrants are moving to the United States for better opportunities. That is an example of migration. Chances are at some point you have someone within your family background that migrated here at some point, whether that's within the last few decades or whether that was a century or two ago. So that is an example of migration. Next is transportation, and transportation is the movement of goods. So, for example, Coca-Cola or Coke is sold in over 312 countries and regions. Coke is not manufactured in every single one of those countries or regions. It's manufactured from a few core places, and then from there it is transported or shipped out to these other countries or regions. So that is an example of a good or a product being moved from one place to another. Lastly is communication, and this is the movement of ideas. So a simple example of this would be social media. We're going to talk about something later in the year called the Arab Spring. This started in 2010, and it was a group of democratic uprisings and revolutions across the Middle East. Social media played a large role in causing those revolutions. Because it gave people in the Middle East access to ideas outside of the region to see what life is like in places like the United States or Europe, and build that want or that desire for a life more similar to what democratic first world nations have. So in other words, social media played a big role in communicating those ideas or communicating the values and the benefits of living in countries like the United States. All right, so that wraps up movement, and let's go ahead and move to our last one, which is human-environment interaction. And so we define this as how the human world and the physical world impact each other. So how do nature or the environment and how do humans impact each other, either positively or negatively? And so let's talk about the three different categories of that. The first is adaptations. And an adaptation is how humans adjust to the environment they're in. So an example of this would be temples carved into the rock in Turkish mountains. And you can see that in this picture off to the top right-hand corner. So in some regions of Turkey, inhabitants still wanted to create shrines or areas where they could worship. And there was not areas to be able to build the big cathedrals or churches or mosques that places that did not have as much mountainous territory where those could be built. And so these people adapted. And so they built their temples or their mosques directly into the mountainsides themselves. This is a version of an adaptation. These Turkish people found a way to adapt the territory or the area they lived in to their religious needs. Second is impacts. This is how human action impacts the environment and how environmental changes impact humans. So, for example, global temperatures are rising due to man-made pollution. So, since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, pollution has become obviously more prominent. As we burn fossil fuels, that creates more and more pollution. And so because of that, global temperatures are rising and rising and rising at a rate that we have not seen before. So that is an example of human actions impacting the environment. Lastly is resources. And this is how humans use the Earth's natural resources for their benefits. So for example, humans mine coal for energy, or we drill for petroleum or oil to create fuel. That is a natural resource that we have found a way to mine or harvest and then process and turn into a fuel source. So that wraps up our basic definition of geography, as well as the 5 themes of geography. I know I flew through that really quick, and you're probably wondering, okay, what use is this to us? How will this help us better understand issues across the globe? Like I said, we're going to take these things, kind of these tools and these themes, and start to apply them tomorrow in class. Now, hopefully by doing that, you'll start to see why these things are useful and why understanding these things and looking for these themes or characteristics can help us better understand the world and better understand what causes the issues within the world. So that is our game plan going forward. Make sure you go to Schoology now and complete the quiz that goes along with these notes. I will see you in class tomorrow. Have a great night.